Hi everybody, this is Anne. I'm the Adult Services Librarian at the E.D. Locke Public Library in McFarland. Just wanted to welcome everybody and thank you for coming. And it is 6:30. It looks like we have a couple more people who may show up, but I won't take too long with this introduction. I am very delighted to be welcoming Jim Rice, local historian, major Packers fan, here to share his memorabilia collection. He's the author of the Packers Century series of books. And so I'll turn it over to Jim here, but thank you all for coming.
Well, thank you, Anne. I appreciate you having me at McFarland. And hello, everyone. And I hope you're up for a quick 1 hour summary of Packer history going from Lambeau to LaFleur. And we'll move along. And Anne, I don't know how you would handle questions or anything, but just keep me posted along the way if I need to stop for a minute to help with anything. Okay?
Sounds great.
All right. Well, I am a retired history teacher, school superintendent, and retired about 10 years ago, and suddenly got caught up with the Packers run to Super Bowl 45, if I've got my numbers correct. And I was fascinated a little bit by three players on that Packer team, Ryan Grant, Charlie Pepra, and Jimmy Robinson, who was a receiving coach, because those three guys had formerly been with the New York Giants. And for full disclosure, I'm originally from New York. I know that doesn't win any points anywhere, but don't shoot me at least. And understand that I've been out here since college. I'm a cheesehead, certainly by now, lived way more of my life here. But it all kind of got started back home in New York. And when the Packers won that Super Bowl in 2010, I had just retired. And so those players inspired me to start looking back into Packer history, specifically with the Giants. But the whole experience that I've had as a former teacher and administrator, this is the most enjoyable thing I've ever done. So it's really kind of neat to do it. It's a lot easier to talk about the Packers, as I'm sure all of you know. What we'll do is we're going to go through photos of things of mine. There are a few things of mine or things in here, like this picture for one, that are not mine. But most, I would say 98.5% of what you see are photos of things that I own. And any history of the Packers, of course, has to start with this picture, I suppose, even though they began playing here several years after they had started. This, of course, those of you probably know, this is the original City Stadium that sits behind still Green Bay East High School that you also see in the picture. It's an interesting photo because in sports history, they often talk about hallowed ground, and you hear about Fenway Park and Wrigley Field and all of these great places, but you never hear about this. And all of the great football players from 1925 through 1956, they all played here. So it is hallowed ground, but because the pro team doesn't play there anymore in Green Bay, they don't really get the just due for this place as they should. But it is really a beautiful place, and the Packers' history there has been memorialized and brought attention to. It must be fantastic for high school seniors to play on a football field where NFL players used to play, and I'm sure they're very aware of that legacy. And so the Packers' history, of course, really kicks off before City Stadium is built. Curly Lambeau, of course, is the gentleman who is responsible for it all. Many folks thought he was a little bit crazy, thinking that people wanted to see more football. Everybody was really in love with college football and boxing and baseball in the late part of the 1910s, 1918, 1919. And people really didn't think there was a market for pro football, but Curly certainly did. And he was one of those visionary kind of guys that always was looking toward the future. So Curly comes back. He spends, oh, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead here. This is the home where the Lambeau family lived when Curly was born on North Irwin Avenue in Green Bay. And Curly, this is pretty close to Green Bay East High School as well and City Stadium. But Curly goes to Notre Dame for one semester, and he plays under Newt Rockne in Rockne's first year coaching at Notre Dame. And the Packers' legacy really begins right here with Newt Rockne. The Packers' major contribution to the NFL has been passing the football. Throughout our 100 years, the Packers have been a passing football team. And when most of us, at least in my generation, think about the Packers, we think about Lombardi and 3 yards in a cloud of dust and running that football. Well, the Packers really, how should I say it? That was a little bit of a blip in Packer history. The Packers have loved throwing the football since the start. And it began really when Curly went to Notre Dame for one semester and learned from Rockne that the future of football was going to be really passing the ball. And Rockne had done some great things in college himself doing that. So Curly comes home from Green Bay at Christmas time in 1918 and does not go back to Notre Dame and kind of misses football. And he runs into George Calhoun, who is the city editor, sports editor, if you will, of the Green Bay Press-Gazette, a very well-connected man. His dad his grandfather was one of the founders of the city of Green Bay. And he and Calhoun kind of team up. Calhoun remembers that Curly was a big star at Green Bay East. And they team up to kind of decide, well, let's see if we can do a pro team. Let's pay these guys. Let's have practices and see if we can make a real run at something very different. So this photo here is the 1919 team, the first Packer team in history. There's Curly right here in the middle, holding the football. And Cal is way over to the right with the beret on his head. And Cal was a very basic reporter from back in the day. Always had a cigar hanging out of his mouth. He was not in good health all the time, so he kind of lived vicariously through these athletes. And he loved the sports, all kinds of sports, but he particularly loved football. This is the second team in 1920 of the Packers. There's Curly again in the middle with the football. And then the Packers, they're so good that they just beat up every team in this town league that they're in for the first couple of years. And they move into what's called the American Professional Football Association in 1921. The league changes its name to the NFL the next year. So this 1921 team for the Packers is the first team in the NFL, the Acme Packers, as they're known then a little bit, from a changing of the guard from the backing of the Indian Packing Company. And so the Packers go into the 1920s. Curly is a great scout for players, but the Packers do not win any championships initially until Curly trades for 3 guys in 1928. Johnny Blood, McNally, great running back, and all these 3 guys I'm going to show you are in the Football Hall of Fame today. Johnny Blood was the Paul Hornung of his day. He drove Lambeau crazy, just like Hornung drove Lombardi crazy. He loved to go out late. He loved to party and have all sorts of fun, but he was kind of a brilliant guy. He was also a poet. So Johnny Blood is the first acquisition by Lambeau. The second one is Mike Mikulski, a great offensive guard and defensive tackle. And the guy that I like the best is Cal Hubbard. This gentleman is a really unique guy. To this day, he's the only person inducted into the Football Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio, and the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. Before he played for the Packers, he was a player for the New York Giants, didn't like New York and demanded a trade to Green Bay. He was traded to Green Bay, and then he becomes a great player on Curly Lambeau's 3 championships in the late 20s, early 30s. After he leaves football, he becomes an umpire in baseball, and he is a supervisor of umpires in the 40s and 50s, and he gets into the Hall of Fame for being an umpire in baseball. So he's quite a special guy, and the fact that he demanded a trade from New York, from the Giants to the Packers, really, in 1928, kind of helped jumpstart my Giant Cheeseheads book, which is about the Packers giant rivalry. So these three players come to the Packers in 1929, and they change a very good team into an outstanding one. This is the first Packer championship team. They only have one tie this whole season. They are undefeated. They give up 22 points all season, which even in a low scoring time was very, very few points. They win again in 1930. They're really on a roll. They're very strong. Here's Hubbard in the middle. If you can see the cursor, he's a pretty big guy, 250 pounds. They thought that was pretty big back in the day. And then 1931, and they comes and they win their third straight championship. Here's Cal right in the back there. And then if you look at this slide, you'll notice something very funny. This is the 1932 standings with Green Bay, Portsmouth, and the Chicago Bears. The Portsmouth Spartans become the Lions in 1934. But if you notice here, the Packers finish in third place because the 6 ties and the 4 ties and the 1 tie that the teams have are not counted in the final standings. So they behaved like the games were never even played. So 6-1 is better than 10-3. And even though the Packers are 3-time defending champions, they do not win in 1932, and the Bears are the champs. But this is a most interesting finish because this is what led to the NFL championship game, which of course we know today has led to the Super Bowl. But in the 1930s, the Packers have some great players. Arnie Herber, a great quarterback. He's the guy who threw many of the touchdown passes to Don Hutson, the great receiver, one of the greatest players in football history. And the third player in the 30s that really leads the Packers back to the top once again is Clark Hinkle. So these three guys lead the Packers back to the 1936 championship game against the Boston Redskins, who are going to move to Washington the next season. And the idea here was the Boston owner didn't like how his team was treated in Boston. So he was going to move to Washington, D.C., and he requested that the championship game not be played in Boston to kind of give it back to the Boston fans a little bit for not supporting the team. And so they moved the championship to the Polo Grounds in New York, and the Packers are in their first NFL championship. When they win this game, it's their 4th championship overall. It's their 4th NFL title, but this is the first one with that one final game. And that goes back to that controversial finish in 1932. And the league decided to split all the teams into 2 divisions and have one final game to make sure that people weren't arguing about who the championship or the champion was. So a couple of years later now, the Packers are in their first NFL title game, and they beat the Redskins pretty handily. Don Hutson, a 46-yard pass from Arnie Herber, starts the scoring. And while more people are passing in the mid-30s, that's still a pretty amazing thing to see. And the Packers handled the Redskins pretty quickly for their 4th championship. A couple of years ago, they wore this uniform as their flashback uniform, if that's the right word they use, or throwback jerseys. And it's quite a great team. Only one loss that season, and Don Hutson and a few other young players are really coming into their own. Buckets Goldenberg, a great player from the Milwaukee area, longtime Packer associate after he played with the team, another great player in the 30s. Cecil Isbell, great Packer quarterback that people have merely not heard a lot about because he only played for 5 years, but he's as good as they come as far as quarterbacks at that time. He could really throw the football, and he was the other guy who threw all the touchdowns to Hudson. So these guys lead the Packers to the 1938 championship game that they lose to the New York Giants. And in 1939, they play the Giants again for the championship, and they beat them in kind of like a revenge game. This game, you may or may not know, Curly Lambeau moved from Green Bay to be played at State Fair Park in West Dallas, just west of Milwaukee. They moved the game there for a couple of reasons. One, it was a bigger stadium, so there were more tickets to sell, more money to be made. And also it was a way, quite a game to do it, but it was a way to thank Milwaukee for kind of the support they had always given the Packers through difficult times. But I'm sure the Green Bay fans had wished they had picked another game to play down in Milwaukee, because this championship game was a great game. The Packers get revenge on the Giants. They win 27-0, and now they've won their 5th championship under Curly Lambeau. This is a Chicago Bears card. It's a 1956 card, but I put it here because the 1940s belonged to the Bears. You can see, let's see here, let me move my little thing here. You can see up top in the left-hand corner, and the man in the double-breasted suit, that's George Halas's brother. George Halas is right below him in the Chicago Bear jacket. And if there are any Bear fans in the audience, I've got to tease you a little. And if there aren't, here's a good joke for those of you that have a Bear fan that you want to tease a little bit. Next to Halas, right here, to Halas's left, is Sid Luckman, right next to number 80. Sid Luckman, and this is the real kind of dig, and it's not even that big of a joke, but it's kind of subtle. You know, Sid Luckman is still the greatest quarterback in Chicago Bear history. And the last pass he threw was in 1950. So if you have a Chicago Bear fan that you just don't know what to say to at some point, you may want to remind him that the Packers, or her, that the Packers have had a few good quarterbacks since 1950, and even before that. But it's kind of a ribbing for good old Chicago Bear fans. And I got to tell you, the Packers would not be in Green Bay if it wasn't for George Halas and the Bears. So we have to respect them and thank them for their support through the years. So the 40s belong to the Bears. They win in 40, 41, 43, and 46. The Packers have some great players that don't win until a few years later. Tony Canadeo, his number is up on the scoreboard at Lambeau. Ted the Bull Fritsch, great fullback and a great teacher and coach in Wisconsin long after his playing career, but also a very powerful big man. Red Smith, assistant coach for Curly, interesting fellow, and he has a little bit of a role in an interesting part in Packer history that's coming up in just a minute. In 1943, Red Smith, the gentleman I just showed you, gets into an argument with Curly Lambeau, and here's Curly up in the top corner of this photo, the top left. He gets into an argument with Curly, and he quits or he gets fired, and the Giants hire him as an assistant coach. And the story here is really that Brett Favre was not the first Brett Favre in Packer history, meaning he wasn't the first guy that really had trouble and had to leave Green Bay with kind of a chip on his shoulder. What happens is Smith goes to the Giants, and in 1944, he convinces Arnie Herber, the former great Packer quarterback who threw the early touchdowns to Hudson in the 1930s. They convince him in 1943 to come out of retirement. It's the Second World War, and a lot of teams brought back former players to bolster their rosters to keep fans interested. So Herber comes out of retirement. Herber and Smith both had issues with Curly Lambeau. They didn't like him when they were there, and they didn't like him after they left, especially in the case of Herber. So Red Smith calls Herber and says, hey, come out of retirement. The Giants need a quarterback. And he probably said something along the lines like, hey, we can, stick it to Curly, kind of like Brett, wanted to stick it to Ted Thompson. So what does Herber do? Of course, athletes love to come back. He comes back. He leads the Giants to the 1944 championship game against the Packers. So that would have been like us playing Brett Favre in the Super Bowl. I mean, Herber was that good and probably the first great passer in Packer history. So to have Herber come back and play against us in that championship game was something else. But of course, we know media was so different back in the day. And Ted Fritsch, that great running back, saved the day with both touchdowns in that 44 championship game. So the Packers beat the Giants 14-7. Curly wins his last championship, and in 1944, he only has a few more years left, but when he left, he had 6 championships, one more than his rival George Halas had at that point in time. So what happens is Lambeau leaves after the 49 season, and the first guy to take over for Curly is a former Chicago Bear. He's a Marquette graduate, Gene Ronzani. He is a coach for the Packers for 4 seasons. And in this little picture, oh, I got the wrong one, but this will work. Before Lombardi comes, okay, Ronzani comes in 1950, Lombardi comes in 59. The other 2 coaches are in the 3rd row of this photo. On the far left is one of them, and on the far right is the other. There were 3 coaches before Lombardi showed up. And here's how badly they did. Ronzani wins 14 games in 4 seasons, 17 for this guy. And then Scooter McLean, who's an assistant coach and a former Bear, by the way, he wins 1 game the year before Lombardi shows up with pretty much the same group that Lombardi turns around and wins 7 games in 1959. So the 50s are a rough time for the Packers with all of those coaches. But they have great players. Tobin Rote, great Packer quarterback. Again, that Packer legacy of passing the football. Rote, many people have forgotten about, but he was a great quarterback in the 50s. He was a great runner as well as passer. And as soon as the Packers traded him to the Detroit Lions, the Lions won the championship behind Tobin Rote, who replaced Bobby Lane. And the Lions have still not won another championship since 1957. When Tobin Rote led them to the title. Other great players in the 50s, Bob Mann, great receiver from the that they acquired from the Detroit Lions. Billy Houghton, another fine receiver in Green Bay in the 50s. John Martin Kovic, great defensive lineman, also an end as well. And he was traded to the New York Giants, and the Packers got a 3rd round draft choice that they turned around and used to draft Ray Nitschke. So the Packers got the better end of that deal against the Giants. But there's blue and gold uniforms, which the Packers often had. And it was Curly's way initially, when he was on board in Green Bay, of honoring the connection with Notre Dame. So the blue and gold has long been in Packer history. Lombardi comes in 59 and things change almost instantly. He changed everything from the color of the uniforms to the pencils they used. And, he was kind of a control guy. Here he is on the sidelines, photo from a book cover, sidelines of the New York Giants, where he came from as an assistant coach for offense. And at the same time, nearly his buddy on that team for the Giants, the great Tom Landry, went to Dallas to coach. And who does Lombardi have to beat? His old buddy from Dallas to get to those Super Bowls early on. So great players for the Packers in the 50s are already there when Lombardi arrives. Bart Starr, of course, Ron Kramer, great tight end. Any of you that have connections to Stevens Point may recognize this is a building. The Packers had training camp in Stevens Point a few years in the 50s, and this is the old junior high up there. And also the last photo here is from Stevens Point as well. Bobby Dillon, probably the greatest Packer that very few fans know about. He still is the all-time interception leader for the Packers. He stopped playing in 1959. And what's amazing about Dillon is he was blind in one eye, but he was still that good of a player. So these 3 guys are certainly great players in Packer history. And most of the players that were acquired before Lombardi arrived were acquired by this man, Jack Venisi, great talent scout. And Lombardi took those Packer players who were kind of getting comfortable losing. They still got paid the same amount of money. They were still famous in the city. But some of them wanted to win more than others, and Lombardi certainly thinned out the crew and turned around the team pretty quickly. Here's a monument across from Lambeau honoring what Jack Venisi did for the team. This is the 1961 Topps card for the Packers. You may want to pick out one number here. Here's Paul Hornung next to McGee. You could pick out any number and just remember where that number is, and you'll see something kind of interesting in a little bit. So in 61, the Packers are in their third year under Lombardi, and they win the NFL championship. They beat the New York Giants 37-0 in Green Bay in a very dominating win for the Packers. The great Paul Hornung, you may know the story. He was in Army Reserve at the time during the Berlin crisis, and Hornung and Ray Nitschke and Boyd Dowler had to serve in the reserve. They were called up, and there was doubt that they would play in the game. Nitschke and Dowler were able to, but Hornung had some difficulty. And the story has it, and it's not a story, it's true. Lombardi calls his acquaintance, President Kennedy, and Kennedy arranges for Hornung's leave to take place a little bit differently than what was planned. And he was able to play in the championship game. He scored 19 points in the game, so I'm sure the Giants were a little bit upset at that and kind of figured what was going on there, you know, and he totally dominated the game, as did the Packers overall. He ran behind the great line of Jim Ringo, Jerry Kramer, one of the greatest backers, Fuzzy Thurston, Bob Skoronski, and then, of course, Forrest Gregg. This is the 1962 team, the Topps card. The 62 team also wins the championship. They beat the Giants again, this time in New York, 16-7. And great play by Jimmy Taylor, carrying the ball a number of times, I want to say 30 times in that game, and beat up Sam Huff pretty well in the game. And the Packers really prevailed in conditions that were very similar, if not worse than the Ice Bowl, from what many people have said. I was only 8 years old at the time, so I hardly remember the game, but I was surprised that the Packers could beat the New York Giants. And I probably cried a little bit because I loved the Giants back in the day. Sam Huff was their great linebacker that Jimmy Taylor took care of pretty easily. So they win in 1962 again. So they've won 2 straight championships. Lombardi is hoping for 3 straight, just like Lambeau got back in the day. So he hopes to tie the great Lambeau. Ray Nitschke, great linebacker, and an MVP in that championship game in 62. Willie Davis, great Packer, passed away recently, I believe. And one great book, Ann, if you're listening, and if you're not, somebody should tell Ann about this. The book Closing the Gap by Willie Davis is probably the best football book I've ever read. And it's about not so much the games, what I write about, but how the practices and what you do as a team in the locker room, how that all plays out in real life. So anybody that knows a coach or a teacher, it's a great book to show how practice counts and how teamwork counts and all of those other things. So Willie Davis, great player. Lionel Aldridge, when I first came to Wisconsin, he was a broadcaster on Channel 4 in Milwaukee, WTMJ, had a great voice. He was the only defensive rookie ever to start for Vince Lombardi. He was a great defensive end, but you may know he had a tragic end to his life. He suffered from depression, and he died a homeless man, but a great Green Bay Packer. Henry Jordan, great defensive lineman, one of the few players along with Willie Davis that was acquired by Lombardi when he came to Green Bay early on. And Jordan came from the Cleveland Browns, great defensive tackle in the Hall of Fame, as well as all these other guys we're talking about almost. And you may not know that Jordan, though he died young from a heart attack, he was one of the early directors, if not the first director of Summerfest in Milwaukee on the lakefront. So Henry Jordan, a very civic-minded man. Willie Wood, great Green Bay Packer, a safety in the Hall of Fame as well as Herb Adderley, his running mate in the backfield. Boyd Dowler, great receiver. And the Packers in 1963 don't win a championship, but you may see that your number and player is still in the same place. For whatever reason, the Packers chose to use the same photo, the same card, basically, for 3 years. Here's Billy Houghton, Billy Houghton was one of the first players Lombardi got rid of when he showed up in 1959, because Houghton was involved in setting up the Players Union, and Lombardi didn't want anything to do with that, and he shipped Houghton out of town pretty quickly. But here he is in 1963, and he's still on the card. I've never read anything as to why, but can't you just see Vince Lombardi telling the photographers in his gruff way, to use last year's card? He never wanted his players to get too much attention. It was a team game, and this kind of stuff distracted from that. But it's an interesting little tidbit in Packer collectible history. So the Packers don't win in 64, or excuse me, in 63, because Horning was suspended, you may remember, for gambling. He and his buddy Alex Karras from the Detroit Lions, and of course Webster fame from the TV show in the 70s. He and Horning were caught gambling and were suspended for the whole year. In 1964, the Packers do not win again. These are very similar cards from back-to-back years against the same team, but in different dates, obviously. This is a card I put up because you see Lombardi here in the corner of this card. You very rarely see Lombardi, or you don't really see him at all in the old cards. You do see him a lot in commemorative cards, but way back in the day, he was never on the cards. You'll see he's never on pictures either of the team. He was not, I guess he didn't enjoy being photographed. And here, the one that they use here, right? He's got his tie on. He's the accountant. He was probably negotiating a contract with Jim Ringo or somebody there. So the Packers, 2 years in a row, they don't win. But in 65, excuse me, in 65, they win again. And this is a great photo, cover of the yearbook. Curly Lambeau, the great Packer owner, founder rather, and coach, and Vince Lombardi. And this is a classic photo because Lambeau has just passed away in June of 1965. They renamed City Stadium Lambeau Field, the same place where they're playing now. And this photo between the two greatest Packer leaders in our history, at least to that point, and probably even to this day, here they are shaking hands. What a great cover for the yearbook. Well, Lombardi was infuriated by it because Lambeau had died in June. They named the stadium after him, but Lombardi was kind of a little bit annoyed. He thought the stadium might have been named after him, even though he hadn't won a Super Bowl yet. But he wasn't a big fan of Lambeau's because Curly was, he was the most famous person in Wisconsin in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, probably even the 50s. And he was kind of like Paul Horning and Max McGee. He liked to have a good time, and he was very social. And Lombardi was not, and he knew that about Curly, and he didn't like it. But yet we all know that he loved Horning and McGee. So you have to go figure on that one. But he was very angry that this was on the cover of the yearbook. But in 65, the Packers win again, and it's the last NFL championship game before the Super Bowl start. Some great players that help in 65, particularly Don Chandler, a great kicker acquired from the Giants. Elijah Pitts, his son Ron played for the team in the 70s. Carroll Dale, fine receiver for the team. Dave Robinson, Hall of Fame linebacker from Penn State. And this is a photo from the 65 championship game. It was played at Lambeau Field, very muddy, rainy day, awful weather. And as I mentioned, it's the last NFL title game before the Super Bowl start. And so in some ways, it's often forgotten. But any of you that are truly great Packer fans that just love everything Packers, if you go on YouTube and you find the 1965 championship game, you would just love to watch it. I mean, especially the second half is really the key to the game. The first drive in the second half is an amazing thing that the Packers do. And they just run the ball right down Cleveland's throat, and they win the game 23-12. And it's worth watching if you have some time. So the Packers beat the Browns 23-12. They're on the cover of Sports Illustrated. Here's Jimmy Taylor in the mud. And it's the first of what are going to become 3 straight titles for the Packers. They win in 65. And then in 66, they're favored again to win the title. That's Jimmy Taylor on the cover. And they go to the first Super Bowl, the merger of the NFL, the National Football League, and the American Football League. And they play the Kansas City Chiefs, and Willie Wood, the great Packers safety, makes a key interception in the second half to turn the game around, certainly in the Packers' favor. And the Packers win that first Super Bowl. Max McGee had a great game, even though he wasn't expecting to play. And you know the story probably. He went out a little late the night before with his buddy Paul Hornung. He wasn't expected to play. Boyd Dowler gets hurt on one of the first plays, and Lombardi has to send McGee in, who has a hangover. He can't find his helmet. And so it's a little bit of a scene, but he gets in the game and he catches a few touchdown passes. And here he is on the cover of Sports Illustrated, and he kind of looks a little winded here. You know, he probably had a rough time getting into the end zone on that first one. So McGee really helps, along with Starr, to lead the Packers for that to that first Super Bowl title. Starr is the MVP, and now they've won in 1965 and in 1966 again. So they have two titles. And this says the 67 Super Bowl champs. Yes, it's 1967, but remember, it's the end of the 66 season. So now going into the next year, Lombardi can tie Curly Lambeau in 67 if they win again. And some great players. Here's the team card. They didn't play any funny jokes with the team card on these guys. But again, you will not see Lombardi anywhere to be found. Here's Nitschke and Willie Wood, but no Lombardi. Here's McGee right at the end, right on the top, with his buddy Paul Hornung right there, ready to jump off and go socialize after the picture. Great players, young players now, Gail Gillingham, Donnie Anderson, great running back, and Jim Grabowski, the Gold Dust Twins, you might recall. They called them the Gold Dust Twins because they were the first group of players in NFL history to earn more than the veterans. This is when rookie salaries began to take off, and the veterans, particularly Jimmy Taylor, didn't care for that too much. But that's why they call them Gold Dust Twins. Their contracts together were right around $1 million, which was unheard of at that time. The great Wisconsin Badger, Kenny Bowman, who I particularly love because not only is he a Badger, but he never gets credit for helping out on that great block in the Ice Bowl that Jerry Kramer so loves to talk about. This is my favorite collectible here. This is the Sporting News reporting on the Ice Bowl and that famous moment where Starr comes over with Lombardi and Zeke Bredkowski to talk about that last play, which of course we know won probably the greatest game in NFL history. So they go to the second Super Bowl and they're going to take on the great Oakland Raiders. And Super Bowl II is in Miami, a little bit warmer than the Ice Bowl. Don Chandler has a great game for the Packers. And here you've got Chandler, you got Bart Starr. Then in the background here for the Raiders, Darryl LaMonica, George Blanda. And then over here, if you can see him, is the great John Madden when he was a little bit younger. And the Packers win Super Bowl II. Lombardi retires and things change pretty quickly. Starr is the MVP of Super Bowl II. So now the Packers have won three straight titles, just like Curly Lambeau did. And those are the only two teams in 100 years in NFL history to ever win three straight championships. And when you think about 1932 and those standings that I showed you a long time ago, the Packers probably got robbed of a fourth one, but the Bears won that one fair and square. So here are the three teams, 65, 66, and 67. Things go downhill very quickly. Lombardi goes upstairs to the general manager's office exclusively in 68, and things begin to slide. Here are all the coaches between Lombardi and Mike Holmgren, Lindy Infante right before Holmgren. Look at the winning percentages, 488, 481, 408, 405, and 375 right before Holmgren shows up. But great players, you know, in that era between Lombardi and Holmgren, great players. John Brockington. It's interesting here, they put the shadow of Vince Lombardi right on the media guide, just in case Bart Starr didn't remember that Vince Lombardi was keeping an eye on things. Great players, Freddie Carr, linebacker, Johnny Gray. Kind of looks like he has a painted on mustache there a little bit, but a fine defensive back. John Hadel, who the Packers drafted, you know, the Lawrence Welk joke, they traded a 1 and a 2 and a 3rd round draft choice for this aging quarterback, which really hampered Bart Starr once he came on board to coach the Packers in a few years. Eddie Lee Ivory, great running back. Great card here, not only James Lofton, Hall of Famer, but Ezra Johnson. You may remember he was the Packer that was caught eating a hot dog on the bench in one game. I think it was a preseason game, but it didn't really reflect well on Bart Starr, unfortunately, because they blamed, of course, everything on Starr. So great players in the 80s, Chester Markhall, Lynn Dickey, and Lynn Dickey, who had injury history, as well as not a great supporting cast around him all the time. Very underrated quarterback who held the Packer record for passing yards until Rodgers broke that record. So he was quite the passing quarterback. Larry McCarron, the Rock, the broadcaster as we know him now, an Illinois boy that was a fine center for the Green Bay Packers. Tim Lewis, who was injured on that Monday Night Football game against the Bears and never played again. John Anderson, great linebacker, Waukesha boy, who went to Michigan and had a fine career in Green Bay. Unfortunately, played for a lot of losing teams. Forrest Gregg comes back in the mid-'80s to try to change things, to kind of bring a little bit of that Lombardi magic back that Bart Starr was not able to capture. But Gregg doesn't do any better. Here's his rival, Mr. Ditka from the Bears. And of course, you know all the stories, the time when Ditka and Gregg ran those two teams, a lot of dirty play, a lot of unsportsmanlike conduct. Mark Lee pulls Walter Payton over the bench at a game, and only Mark Lee is booted out of the game, not Walter Payton. This gentleman you may know, George Cumby, linebacker. He was the guy who had to be run over by Refrigerator Perry on Monday Night Football, and I believe it was 1985, maybe 86, but a true embarrassment that was not forgotten by the Packers. And Charles Martin, this is a playing card. It's not a football card. It was hard to find one of this guy. And he's an infamous Packer. I'm sure anybody that was a Packer fan in the 80s know all about Mr. Martin, but for those of you that don't, he, during a play against the Bears in a game, on an incompleted pass, he picked up the Bears quarterback, Jim McMahon, slammed him to the turf, separated his shoulder, and the Bears did not repeat as Super Bowl champions in 1986, probably mostly because of what Martin did. The most unsportsmanlike thing I had ever seen on a football field, and he was suspended, I think, for 2 games. Today, he'd probably never play again, or at least you think he wouldn't. But couldn't happen to a nicer guy, though, Jim McMahon. But so Mr. Martin, not a great period in Packer history, especially with that exclamation point on it. So Lindy Infante comes after Gregg. They start getting a little better thanks to the Magic Man, a Virginia product, University of Virginia, who led the 1989 Cardiac Pack to almost the playoffs, the closest they had come in years. So things seem to be turning around. Anthony Dilwig, whose grandfather played on the Packers in the 20s, Lavi Dilwig, is a backup quarterback on the team. How could we forget this man, Tony Mandrich? Draft pick in I want to say 88, 89. And he had some steroid history, which caused him problems, and he never materialized as a great player, given that he was a first-round draft choice. But Mandrich, that time in Packer history, many people would like to forget because of the Mandrich situation. And fortunately, Bob Harlan is appointed president, elected president of the Packers by the board. And he is the guy who you can still thank for why the Packers are doing so great in 2020, shall I say, because Harlan turned things around in the early 90s. Big fan of this man. He went to Marquette, where I went to, and he really did some great things for the franchise. So we can thank Harlan, who hired Ron Wolf, who hired Mike Holmgren, and those two guys put their careers, in a sense, on the line by sending a #1 draft choice to the Atlanta Falcons for a party happy quarterback who hadn't impressed anybody in his first year in the NFL. Brett Favre was a very fun guy, as you all know, and he certainly was at the peak of his fun, shall we say, at this point in his life. And Ron Wolf just had a feeling about him, and fortunately it was correct, because he was an expensive guy, losing a first-round draft choice, but it certainly was worth it, as we well know. And Favre, of course, didn't do it alone. Great help from Reggie White, who everybody said would never come to Green Bay. Well, he did come to Green Bay. Whether God told him to come here or not, like he said, who knows? But you certainly have to believe the guy, I would think. But I'm sure the $13 million had a little bit to do with it as well. But Reggie, not only a great player, great man, great role model, and of course dies way too young. And so the Packers are kind of on the way back. They're starting to make national news. People were like, hey, they're still even playing in the league. Nobody had heard much about them for almost 30 years. So they're making headway. They've got the great gravedigger Gilbert Brown to help them get there, along with Leroy Butler, who may make the Hall of Fame this time around, we can hope. And the Packers really are turning the corner. This is the last game at County Stadium in Milwaukee when the Packers played the Falcons. And you may remember Favre dove into the end zone on the last play of that game to assure a spot in the playoffs for the Packers. So the Packers are starting to head toward, hopefully, a championship. Great players. Here's Sterling Sharp bringing the ball back to Brett, hoping for another pass from Favre pretty quickly. And Antonio Freeman, who has caught the most touchdown passes that Brett Favre ever threw for the Packers. And in '96, here's Freeman catching a touchdown pass against the Carolina Panthers at Lambeau in the NFC, I should say, championship game. And they go off to the Super Bowl finally after 29 years. It's been a long time since Lombardi was there. And they're playing right in Brett's backyard in New Orleans. And this game, you know, I think sometimes we remember Brett and we think about all those games he had, some of the big games where he threw, what was it, against St. Louis? He threw 5 interceptions in a playoff game once, maybe it was 6. But this game was a fantastic game for Favre. Threw 2 touchdowns, scored one himself, and led the Packers to the promised land like no one had been able to in a long time. So a fantastic game by the leader of the team. Reggie, of course, helped seal it at the end of the game in the second half with 3 sacks of Drew Bledsoe, the quarterback of the Patriots. And the Packers win this game 35-21. So they're Super Bowl champs again, believe it or not. Here's Desmond Howard, who's the MVP for all the return yardage in that game. And all the publications begin to tout the greatness of the Packers and what a fantastic year it was. And it certainly was. And I'm sure all of us remember where we were when they won that title in 1996, actually in January of '97. So the Packers come back to Green Bay. They don't win another Super Bowl under Favre, but they get to the Super Bowl the next year and lose. Reggie, of course, passes away way too soon in 2000 after he had left Green Bay. And finally, in the early part of the 2000s, Lambeau Field, as you know, was extensively remodeled and has become the jewel that it is today. It's just a great place and certainly respects all this great history that we're talking about. So the Packers remodel Lambeau Field, and here I love this picture because here you have Lombardi statue and Lambeau statue over here. They're far apart now. They're not shaking hands, but I'm sure Lombardi's still a little bit upset that Lambeau's pointing at him for some reason, but kind of a neat thing to see up at the stadium. Great players after those Super Bowls in the 90s. Donald Driver, Mike Sherman, the old coach of the Packers, Brett Favre is getting a little bit up in years in 2004, and he begins to waffle a little bit on whether or not he wants to play every year. And in fact, Packer fans, he certainly was not the first Packer to do that. Don Hutson, the greatest receiver in Packer history, did that all the time after about his 6th season. He would always be indecisive like Brett was. And when he actually did retire, he was an assistant coach for the Packers from 1945 to 48. George Halas, the coach of the Bears, always thought Hutson was going to sneak back on the field, and so he kept his defensive plans for Don Hutson for a number of years after Hutson retired, because he always thought he was coming back. So Brett Favre isn't the only guy to do what he did, and of course we know everybody leaves Green Bay eventually. Lombardi left Green Bay, but it was a tough one for all of us. McCarthy comes along to replace Sherman, and they draft. They strike gold immediately with Aaron Rodgers as an eventual successor to Brett Favre. Favre's last card in 2007 for the Packers, and that was a very, very magical year. You may remember they almost went all the way, not quite. This is a favorite card of mine because here, of course, is Favre. To your left here is Amon Green and Donald Driver. So here you have the 3 statistical leaders in Packer history, the leading passer, receiver, and rusher in the team's history. In 2007, they beat Seattle in that great game in the snow at Lambeau Field, thanks to Ryan Grant to a great degree. But they don't get to the Super Bowl. They are beaten by the Giants, but Favre is Sportsman of the Year, just a fantastic season for a quarterback ending toward the end of his career. Then, of course, the great divorce. He decides to leave, and what a hard time for all of us that are Packer fans to deal with that. But fortunately, finally it all went by the wayside. And when he came back a couple of years ago and remembered the name of the parking attendant and the people who served him food and the weight room guys that helped him, he didn't talk about all the rich people he knew. He talked about the regular people like him who helped him become the great player that he was. So kind of nice. Favre leaves, and in 2010, the Packers get to the Super Bowl, which was kind of interesting because, Favre left. Part of the reason is he wanted to get back to a Super Bowl, and he thought other teams had a better chance to do that than the Packers. So kind of an interesting thing there. So Rodgers leads the Packers beginning in 2008 after Favre moves on, and does pretty well pretty quickly. He has us back in the Super Bowl in the 2010 season. One of my favorite photos here. I was not real big fan of Favre while that divorce was going on. I've long ago forgiven him now, but I love this photo of Clay Matthews here because in 2010 we beat the Vikings twice to get Brett Favre back. So they get to the Super Bowl. They beat Philadelphia. They play Atlanta, who we're playing on Monday night next week in one of Aaron Rodgers' greatest games. Atlanta was the #1 seed that year. And then they go on to beat our favorite Chicago Bears in the first playoff game against them since 1941. And the Packers win that game. B.J. Raji, that great interception, and of course, the big dance he did in the end zone was worth the price of admission alone. And it was a great celebration for the Packers as they came to an end of that game. So they get to that Super Bowl in North Texas, and a great game for the Packers. What a great team, 15 players on the injured reserve by the end of the year. So those backups really brought that next man up philosophy to life and really brought them to the highest heights of the NFL. And Nick Collins started it with a great interception, thanks to Howard Green's deflection, and Ben Roethlisberger put that one up. Rodgers and Nelson, as well as Rodgers and Greg Jennings, have a great game. And the championship belt makes its appearance as the Packers put away the Steelers in a very exciting game. Here's the team photo. And remember, Curly Lambeau had one assistant coach. These are all assistant coaches in the white here. So And this is, again, 2010, so there's probably 2 or 3 more. Quite a different game as the decades move on. So the Packers are big cheese. They beat Pittsburgh to win their 13th NFL title, the most of any team, and some great publications celebrating a championship game, or a championship that's been long awaited since Favre's championship in '96. They certainly have been good all through most of those years, but no championship, unfortunately. And I think we're kind of spoiled as Packer fans. You know, people really give the Packers a lot of grief for not winning it every year. It's kind of something, it's something to really behold, and it's kind of unfair to the team. It's kind of like the Yankees in baseball. If they don't win it every year, it's sad, and it's they need somebody to blame, and it's unfortunate. And the Packers are becoming a little bit that way because we're so good. So yeah, I guess it's the price you pay. Here's that Hail Mary in Seattle, you may remember a few years ago, that we like to forget. Donald Driver, of course, dances his way into retirement, the great dancing man. Eddie Lacy, great rookie in 2013. And Rodgers in 2013, that's the year where he broke his collarbone against a game on Monday night, I believe it was, against the Bears. And everybody wondered, was he coming back? Was he coming back? And he finally did. Played the Bears in that last game of the season. And in the last minute of the last game, throws that touchdown pass to Randall Cobb, and the Packers get into the playoffs, and the Bears go home. And they've had a number of incredible games against the Bears in the last number of years. This one in 2017, the Packers win, I can't even remember the score here, 55-14, I believe it was. Just a dominating game. And what was most interesting the next day was to see the headlines of the Chicago sports section in the Tribune honoring this dominant performance by the Packers at Lambeau. And they called it the Lambeau bleep as the Packers really blow out the Bears. Rodgers MVP again in 2014. There are a number of seasons we're not going to get into because of some of those disappointing losses. Jordy Nelson gets hurt in 2000, and was at 16-17, and the season is in trouble because of that, and for other reasons as well. Brett comes back and is accepted back into the fold, has his number retired. Great moment in Packer history. Hopefully all the wounds have been bound up, and that he'll always be welcomed back fondly. And a number of playoff games have happened that are worth remembering. Great one against the Giants. Great catch by Randall Cobb on that Hail Mary pass. And then the great catch by Jared Cook on the sidelines against Dallas. And they win the game because Mason Crosby has to kick the field goal. And he has to do it twice because Dallas called the timeout. And it was a 50-some-odd yard field goal, I believe. It was not a chip shot. And he did it twice, and the Packers won that game. Great games against the Bears. You may know that we've tied that series up. It had been a long, long time. The Packers had not led the rivalry over the Bears since 1932. So they finally caught up at the 94 win mark for both teams, thanks to great play by Brett Favre and Aaron Rodgers over the last 30 years. And they finally went ahead in the rivalry the next year. And then just, 2 years ago, great comeback, the greatest fourth quarter comeback in Packer history against the Bears when Rodgers got hurt, went out for a little while and came back in the second half to lead the Packers back to a great game and a great way to start out the season. It was the opener. Devontae Adams on the cover of the 2018 yearbook. And then, of course, on last year's yearbook, Matt LaFleur. What a great first season for a young coach to win 13 games and get one game from the Super Bowl will be a memory. And I'm sure he wants one more game this year, as we all do. The last thing to show you, other than this is the victory over Seattle this past year in the playoffs. I have one more thing here. I think it's the next card. Yeah, this is the last thing to show you. This is a card from 2006 where the Dunruss Company put Aaron Rodgers on the card. And as we all know, Rodgers sat behind Brett Favre for 3 years didn't really take the helm until 2008. And so it's kind of nice to have this card with the three greatest Packer quarterbacks in our lifetime on one card together. So Ann and audience who's out there, that's the end of the Packers century. I'd love to answer any questions anybody might have, and I don't know how you handle that, Ann, but I'll leave it to you from here on. It's back to you.
If anybody has a question, just type it in the chat box, and I'll read it out loud so everyone can see.
How did that go? Okay? You think it went okay for everyone?
I think this was great. I certainly enjoyed seeing this walk through Packers history.
It's a quick one, but we do cover all 100 years.
Yeah.
And they've played 1,448 games, and I have documented all of those games. I've written about every one of them on my website, packerscentury.com. And in fact, some of my friends who are writers that I've checked with, they've told me I'm the only person to have ever written about every Packer game ever played. So it's kind of a nice claim to fame, so to speak. And you can find more about what I do and the books I've written at packerscentury.com.
Excellent. One participant did say great presentation, and I really agree with that. This was fascinating. Did anyone have any questions? We'll give it another minute here.
And you could see everything pretty well, I assume, huh?
Oh, yeah. Here's someone asking if you have season tickets and when did you get them? And if not, are you on the waiting list? He is on the list, and this was there are 100,000 people ahead of him.
Yeah, no, I don't. I'm not on the list. I've never had tickets, but I've been fortunate enough to go to a number of games just from friends who have tickets. And the tickets, of course, just amazing. And I'll tell you a very fast story. I've learned about a family whose mother, who has gotten up in years, who would bring all the kids home, during the summer, and they talk about what games they were all going to go to, and they would divide up the tickets. Well, brothers and sisters, you know how that can get pretty heated at times. And as the mom got older, she really struggled with the fact that they would always argue over these tickets. But of course, it was just good sibling, discussions and whatnot, no long-term damage. But the mom got so tired of it, she went back and turned her tickets back into the Packers.
Oh, no.
That's a story you don't hear very often, and it's true. It does happen every now and then.
Oh, my goodness. We have another question. Says, great presentation. What if the Packers drafted Barry Sanders instead of Tony Mandrich? Yeah.
And was that Troy Aikman too, or there was another one in that group that they could have had? Yeah, isn't that something? What woulda, coulda, shoulda, I guess, right? I mean, I don't know what to say, because when Mandrich was on that cover of Sports Illustrated, boy, he sure impressed everybody, and the Packers, like everybody else, he had all the, the measurables, as far as the speed and the height and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, we would have saved a few seasons of losing had we had Barry Sanders.
That is all the questions I see.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you had me here, or there, I should say, even though I'm here, you're there. Thanks to the wonders of technology.
Yes.
And check out the website yourself if you'd like. It's good stuff. And if I can ever do anything more for you guys, let me know.
Excellent. Thank you so much for coming and for adjusting to our virtual presentations. And another thank you from the audience. He loved it. And thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And maybe we'll do it again someday.
Excellent. Looking forward to it.
Okay. Have a great day and go Pack. They play Atlanta on Monday. And if you watch the pregame show on Channel 12 or Channel 12 in Milwaukee, WISN, they just did a story on me today. So it might be on there before the game.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. Well, thank you again, Ann. Have a great day, or night, I should say.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for coming, everybody. Good night.
Bye now.